Fox News alerts, led by California. A total of 16 states tonight joining forces, trying to block President Trump from using emergency powers to build the border wall. And no surprise, those states are filing their lawsuit within the Ninth Circuit, which has regularly blocked the president's plans. But tonight, the White House says it is confident of a big win if this, as it likely will, goes all the way to the Supreme Court.
We will have a national emergency, and we will then be sued, and they will sue us in the Ninth Circuit, even though it shouldn't be there, and we will possibly get a bad ruling.
And then what?
And then we'll end up in the Supreme Court, and hopefully we'll get a fair shake, and we'll win in the Supreme Court, just like the band. They sued us in the Ninth Circuit, and we lost.
And then what?
And then we lost in the appellate division, and then we went to the Supreme Court, and we won.
Protests outside the White House against the president's declaration of a national emergency as there's growing legal and political challenges to the plan. What's the way forward for President Trump and the country?
Being brought to this country, but we cannot wait and.
Well, it is heating up. New protests outside the White House against the president's national emergency declaration amid escalating legal challenges to his efforts to help secure funding for a wall on the southern border. Senior advisor to the president, Stephen Miller, on Fox News Sunday, predicting a huge portion of the wall will be built.
What the president was saying is that like past presidents, he could choose to ignore this crisis, choose to ignore this emergency, as others have, but that's not what he's going to do. Well, you're going to see probably a couple hundred miles in time I would say, by the end of the next appropriation cycle.
So by the end of this year,
by the end of,
hundreds of miles?
Next fiscal year, one more after this.
Okay, so by September of 2020. Right in the middle of the presidential campaign.
Oh, what timing? Meantime, the first lawsuit challenging the emergency declaration has been filed by liberal advocacy group Public Citizen and California Attorney General Javier Becerra. He says he's working with several other states to mount another legal challenge, quote, imminently. Let's take a look.
A number of states and certainly Americans will be harmed, and we're all going to be prepared. He himself said it. He did not need to announce or declare a crisis. He did not have to call this an emergency. He has also said he knows he's going to lose in court.
Well, that's fine. Even multiple Republicans in the House and Senate object to the national emergency declaration. Among them, border state Republican Congressman Will Hurd.
Our government was designed for the most ultimate power, the power of the purse, to reside within Congress, and we shouldn't have an executive, I don't care if it's Republican or Democrat, that tries to get around Congress with this national emergency. I'm always open to making sure that Congress takes back some of its power as a co-equal branch of government.
Amen. What a wonderful time for that discussion. And revisiting the Constitution, Will Hurd also brought up some great points, Chris, about eminent domain in Texas and how thousands of ranchers have plots of land that will indeed be ripe for a government taking. And they will fight the federal government in court over that.
The Republicans in Congress are kind of funny on this because they're always pushing back and saying that Congress needs to assert itself against the executive. But every time they come into power, usually the first thing they cut is their own congressional budgets. John Boehner cut Congress's budget and then said, we'll deal with the executive later. It's no surprise that everyone who's in Congress in their mid-20s, maybe their first or second job, where you're fighting career employees, and they're going to beat them most of the time. But President Trump seems to have learned his lesson on the earlier immigration ban rollouts and things like that. Our legal analyst at the News Foundation, Kevin Daly, said that by focusing on building walls in Texas first and using congressional money that's already been appropriated and using money from the Treasury that's already been seized, he's going to severely limit the amount of people who have the ability to bring a lawsuit against him to the Fifth Circuit or maybe to Washington, D.C.'s more moderate circuit. And that's going to make it so that by the time California really has standing to sue him, he's going to actually build, like Stephen Miller said, a lot of this wall.
Well, Hawaii is jumping in as well because they've got some tremendous issues with their poorest borders. I mean, I was really surprised to see that Hawaii being lumped in with Oregon and California. It's like, you
never
get
know.
them.
You know, what's interesting is this is being compared a lot to President Obama's move as it relates to DACA. And I'm not a lawyer, but I did talk to a few people this morning to try to get a better understanding of the difference between when President Obama made the DACA move versus President Trump's national emergency move. And one of the points that was made is that DACA, Republicans made, was actually abuse of prosecutorial discretion. That's a long word for a Monday. But essentially, a prosecutor can say, I'm not going to prosecute you, Melissa, because you're here illegally, and I'm just going to choose not to use my resources to do that. There's a difference between that versus saying, Melissa, not only am I not going to prosecute you, I'm going to confer legal status on you versus via an executive order. And so the president and his team will point to a number of times that plenty of things have been approved via a national emergency. And that's, I think, where they're going to parse the difference between what President Obama did and what President Trump has done.
Well, it's really interesting because so much more power is going to shift to the Supreme Court in terms of their, if it does make its way to the Supreme Court, and that will become critical for liberals and conservatives, because conservatives will see that the sky is falling. The next president has to be a Democrat in order to rebalance the court, because the president is saying no matter what the legal challenges are, it'll go to the Ninth Circuit, then the appellate court will lose, then it'll go to the Supreme Court, and we will win because there is a conservative majority.
Although I'm not totally sure that he's right about that. I mean, he's done a bunch of things along the way to kind of undermine his own case. I mean, when he stood there and said, I don't really need to do this, you're like, yikes.
Yeah.
That was...
That sort of lessen the emergency part of it.
Yeah, it does make it tough. I mean, other legal experts have said it matters so much more what he writes versus what he says. And of course, in that very long press conference, he did say almost everything. So, you know, you could kind of put something into every little basket there. But I don't know that his confidence at the Supreme Court level, again, I'm not a lawyer either, it doesn't necessarily seem to me like that is for sure the case. And he had a bunch of evidence to go, and it was that one piece of money that he wanted for this. It was only a few of those billions that he was putting together, of those 8, that depended on calling it a national emergency.
And speaking of the legality, and Kennedy, something that you brought up was Will Hurd talking about the 1,000 farmers that could stand to lose land. There are still people in court over the 2006 Secure Fence Act that are trying to figure out money that they are owed.
You're absolutely right. Those eminent domain cases can take a long time.
Absolutely. So the legality of all this is going to take a long time, and that wall is there, so you can still build a wall on land even when you're still working out the money aspect of it. I just don't think that President Trump needed to do this. I mean, the proposal was bad, and he signed a bad plan, but he's the ultimate spin master. He could have spun it into a win. 55 new miles of fencing, 120 miles of fencing that we're going to make better.
More money for judges.
Exactly. Yeah. $3 billion that he could have used that doesn't need a national emergency to obtain.
If Congress wants to take their power back, then why don't you figure out what the holes are in the theoretical immigration fence and fix those and figure out how many people need to come into this country and work legally and make the system better so Beto O'Rourke doesn't have to callous his poor hands by tearing the fence down himself.
And Congress has no interest in solving this problem. Republicans would rather see it in their rearview mirror. They think it's a hot button issue that's not going to help them. Democrats are completely against it. They're not willing to solve the Dreamer issue like when President Trump suggested that last. And they're certainly not willing to provide more funds for this wall. So he's dealing with a Congress that has zero interest and zero motivation to try and fix this emergency.
But it's too bad they don't want to use that as an opportunity to seize back their power, like you said. That would be great.
Yeah, do your job.
Do your job.
Stop complaining about it. Or not.